Energy Charter Treaty was negotiated in the early 1990s after the Cold War. It was officially ratified by this country in 1999. I'm joined on the line now by the Sinn Fein Senator Lynn Boylan, who has done a detailed examination of this particular treaty. Lynn Boylan, good evening to you and welcome to the programme.
Good evening to you too, and thanks a million for inviting me on to talk about it.
You're very welcome indeed. I was reading, indeed it is, and I was reading your paper earlier in the day. This is highly technical, so for the benefit of both myself and our listeners, if you could keep it as simple as possible. First of all, what is it, the background to it, and why you're concerned, even though Ireland ratified it over 20 years ago now?
Okay, so it's basically an agreement, an investment agreement that the EU and other countries signed up to, which protects investors. So if investors want to go into a country, particularly energy investors, so it only covers the energy market. If they want to build a coal-fired plant, if they want to explore for gas or oil, or anything to do with energy at all, the investments are protected under this treaty. And as you said, it came out of the Cold War. Back in the 90s, when I suppose the breakdown of the Soviet Union, there were oil and gas rich nations, but the EU also was very keen at the time to be sort of liberalising its energy market. So it's a product of its time, but to basically put it in very plain language, it's an investment treaty that countries enter into that guarantees protections for investment companies who want to develop energy industries in those countries.
And why was it felt necessary to give them this protection? Was it because otherwise there would be no investment, somewhat like the situation in relation to offshore oil or gas?
I suppose it's a product of its time in a sense that these investment clauses or protection measures that were enshrined in various treaties, there's over 2,000 of these type of arrangements around the world. The Energy Charter Treaty is one of the older ones in the sense of it has a very old model of investment protection, but it goes back to a mindset that you can't trust certain governments to not seize your assets if you're an investor, and that this way it kind of gives a certain amount of protection to investors. They're an outdated approach to investment, but also all of the evidence has shown that it doesn't actually encourage investors to come into countries. So the OECD have done analysis of this and other organisations, and they say that it doesn't actually encourage investment, but it was a thing of its time that it was saying that you had to give this protection to investors in order to encourage them in. At this point now, it's very outdated, but especially in a country like the EU where you have, we all have our court systems that are accessible to investors that they could choose to use domestic courts. They don't need to have an additional layer of protection that it allows them to go to private courts, a system that's not available to ordinary citizens. This is especially just for large investors. So they are a thing of their past, and which is why I argue, I suppose, that this treaty needs to just be buried and done away with because it's not fit for purpose.
Yeah, just in relation to the ratification by Ireland in 1999, there was very little, if any, interest back then in this particular treaty by members of both Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann. I'm not suggesting that it was ratified on the nod, but there was very little political interest in it.
Zero debate. No debate at all. It was the motion was laid before the Dáil and the Seanad and voted through with no official vote. In the defence of the politicians at the time, they probably weren't as clued into. It's the only investment treaty that Ireland has ever ratified. We've never had that form of investor protection. So politicians wouldn't have been aware of the nature of the protection that they were giving. That's not excusing them and letting them off the hook. They have a job to do. They should have known. But also the type of investor courts that are included in this treaty, they've really only ramped up in the last 15 to 20 years. So it's becoming more of an issue now than it was at the time that we ratified this treaty. Companies are increasingly using the provisions under these type of treaties to, one, sort of frighten governments off making decisions, but also in the case of, I suppose, the Energy Charter Treaty, you have fossil fuel companies who are looking at the future and going, okay, can we get compensation out of governments because we're going to end up with a whole pile of stranded assets as we phase out the use of fossil fuels. So in their defence, they might not have been clued into the risks, just given the nature that those risks have escalated over the last number of years, but also the fact that it was the first and only treaty of its type that Ireland has ever ratified.
And as an example, Lynn, let's say for argument's sake a company invests in this country in accordance with the provisions of the Energy Charter Treaty. And if in the course of that investment there's a breach by the host state, let's say Ireland for the purpose of this conversation, there has been a breach of some provision of the treaty, what happens then in terms of settling the dispute that has arisen?
So what can happen is the investor can threaten legal action against the state, but instead of using the domestic court, it can bypass them altogether and it can go to what's called an investor tribunal. These are courts that are held behind closed doors. The papers are not accessible to the public or to anybody other than the parties that are involved in the action. You have a system where a judge or an arbiter on the panel could have been representing the same company in a previous tribunal. So there's real issues around the independence of the lawyers who take the case then becoming arbiters in another case, and conflicts of interest. So that's what can happen, and I hope we get the chance to discuss, I suppose, examples of where that is happening currently in the EU against Spain and against the Netherlands. But there's also another element where it can just be the threat of legal action can be enough to stop a government taking a policy decision. So, for example, the Irish government tried to introduce the smoky coal ban nationwide, and most people would be familiar with this. We've had the smoky coal ban in Dublin since the late 80s. They were legally threatened by the companies about taking that action. And interestingly, so while we can't prove that they would have gone all the way to a tribunal, it was interesting that the companies that wrote that letter to the minister at the time were all companies that had their headquarters outside of Ireland. So therefore they would have been eligible to use the provisions of this treaty because it only applies to foreign investors, so not Irish-based investors. So that's an interesting example. It certainly paused that policy measure. We're only looking at introducing it now. But it had that chilling effect that the government sort of said, okay, well, we'll hold off for the moment and not introduce a nationwide smoky coal ban because of the legal threat.
And you mentioned Spain there. As I understand it, the number of cases which have arisen under the treaty has increased significantly since 2013, and Spain, with 48 cases, is the country with the most of those challenges. Now, can you just explain what's been happening in Spain and how these cases have come about?
So what happened is Spain was following an EU direction, which was countries needed to encourage renewable energy to set up in each member state. And member states were asked to go away and look at a way of incentivising renewable energy. As we see in Ireland, we're currently looking at offshore wind. So Spain did that, and Spain decided particularly to focus on solar energy. And they were very, very successful at encouraging investors into the solar energy. Now, in the defence of the investors, the tariff that was being offered by the Spanish government at the time was very generous. So it was very successful at encouraging solar energy investment. What happened then, though, was you had the financial crash, and the Spanish government were, I suppose, having to continue to pay this very favourable tariff, and they started running a huge deficit in terms of their finances. So they decided to reduce the tariff they were going to pay to the solar energy farms, and at that point then the foreign investors, so Spanish companies, and there were lots of cooperatives as well in Spain who had invested in solar energy, but the foreign investors then decided to start taking legal cases against the Spanish state, saying you can't reduce the tariff, because we had a legitimate expectation that this was going to be our profit and our future profits into the future. So there's 48 cases. They, to date, in the most recent information that we have, Spain won 3, lost 16 of those cases, and there's 27 are still pending. But the costs that we know of, because again, all of this happens behind closed doors, is that already the Spanish state is on the hook for 880 million euros in compensation, and that doesn't include the legal costs. And generally, the government will pick up, the state will pick up the legal costs for both their own defence, but also the costs of the company if they lose the case. So very, very significant costs facing the Spanish state as a result of just them exercising their decision to reduce the tariff, because they were bankrupt. The country was on its knees during the financial crash.
Now, you've also mentioned, Lynn, there, the Netherlands, and this is very interesting because in the case of the Netherlands, the legal proceedings in this instance are being taken by investors in coal-fired power plants as a result of the Dutch decision to phase out coal plants by 2030. So while the Dutch government is attempting to deal with the issue of global warming, it's being penalised as a result of doing so, and now finds itself being sued.
Absolutely. And so what had happened was that the Dutch government lost the case, the climate case, the landmark climate case that was taken by citizens calling on the Dutch government to do more on climate action and to fulfil their obligations under the Paris Agreement. So the Dutch government lost that case and were forced to revise their ambition on climate action. So one of the things they looked at in terms of where could they make emission cuts very fast, and that was, of course, coal-fired power plants. So they decided in 2017 to issue law that said it was going to phase out the use of coal-fired power plants. And at that point, then you had the legal proceedings kicked in by particularly two large companies who are now suing the Dutch state for approximately 3 billion euros in compensation for the phase-out of those coal-fired power plants. And again, on the basis that they were invited in by the Dutch government, which is true. At the time, in 2009, 2010, the Dutch government were facing high energy prices, which is similar to what we're seeing now in Ireland, and they were reliant on gas. So they invited coal investors in. The coal-fired power investors are saying, well, we expected this to be a 30-year project. The Dutch government lose a case, and they're trying to make those decisions around how do you tackle climate change, how do you fulfill your obligations under the law, and they're now being sued for trying to phase out those coal-fired power plants.
And Lynn, if we bring this to Ireland, Ireland has just approved the climate bill, and that ensures sectoral carbon emission reductions of 51% by 2030, I think. If that impacted negatively on one of those investor companies, I presume that under the treaty, Ireland could be sued.
Absolutely, yeah. And what's interesting at the moment, because when we're seeing the amount of data centres that are propping up around the country, and we're being told that our energy system is under severe pressure, we're currently inviting what's called temporary gas-fired power plants to establish in Ireland to meet that demand. And the problem is that you can invite them in and you can call them temporary, but once they're established here, they're then fully protected by this treaty. So any future government who would say, look, that was temporary, we now want you to close down, well, you can do that. Nobody's saying a government can't make that decision. The problem is, how much is it going to cost the government for making that decision, because they will be liable to pay compensation if the legal action is taken against them by the gas-fired power plant. And
just in relation to Ireland itself, would Ireland, or is there a mechanism by which Ireland could withdraw from this treaty? Because I was reading earlier, as I say, that a number of countries are becoming rather frustrated, not least France and Spain. So could Ireland actually move to leave this treaty, or is it a bit like the line in Hotel California, you can check out any time you like, but you can never leave?
Yeah, unfortunately, it comes with a 20-year sunset clause, which effectively means if you leave, the investors remain protected for 20 years from the date at which you leave. Now, Italy left back in, I think it was 2016, because Italy was also being sued by a number of investors under this treaty. And effectively, the Italian government took a decision, well, it's better to be out and start winding that clock down rather than staying in and prolonging the inevitable that you're going to get sued. So you can walk away unilaterally, as Italy did, and in fairness to them, they're now sort of 6 years into their 20 years. But what my preference would be that the EU would leave as a bloc, because if that was to happen, then effectively the treaty would collapse, because the EU is the biggest, sort of most influential bloc of members that are party to this treaty. So it would be much better if the EU were to just to take a stand and say, look, this treaty, it is what it is. It's no longer fit for purpose. It's not Paris compliant. It's going to cost every member state a huge amount of money in terms of compensating, money that could be spent on making sure that we have a just transition in climate action for citizens. So we should just leave it. Unfortunately, the Irish government doesn't support that position at the moment, where, as you said, there's a growing number of countries within the EU who are frustrated. They're trying to reform it. The reforms are tinkering around the edges. So they've more or less said, look, we need to leave. We need to at least consider leaving. But unfortunately, Ireland, the Irish government is not in agreement at that point. So we have, the French, the Spanish. There's a Nordic state as well, haven't gone public, but they've called for removal. So I think at this stage now there's 6 member states who are calling for the EU to leave. And what I would like is that Ireland would join that voice and walk away. And if that's not possible, set a date at which they will then choose to leave unilaterally if they can't get the EU to agree to leave as a bloc.
And just one final point, is there an argument to be made that the compatibility of the treaty with European law could be challenged in the European Court of Justice?
So there's been 2 cases that have looked at the investor protections, and what the European Court of Justice has said is that these arbitration courts, these private courts, are not compatible with EU law. So the Energy Charter Treaty is not compatible when it's for intra-EU disputes. So, for example, if a French investor had invested in the Netherlands, they couldn't take the Dutch government to court because it's an intra-EU dispute. The problem is that European law is a separate body of law to international law, and the Spanish have gone and argued in their 48 cases. The Dutch have argued in their recent cases that, these are intra-EU disputes, so you can't judge. The arbitration system has no jurisdiction, and effectively the arbitration system has said, thanks for that information, but we don't accept it. You signed up to an international treaty. It's accepted under international law, and therefore they're going to proceed with the cases. So there's that element in that you have, on one hand, the European Court of Justice saying one thing, the international courts are saying, not our problem. But equally, all you have to do, because the provisions under this treaty are so old and outdated, all you would have to do is set up basically a brass plate company in, for example, Britain, and bypass the inter-EU law anyway. So any company could just do that, and already you can see that corporate law firms are advertising the fact that investors should set up these brass plate companies in Britain now with Brexit because they can bypass the European Court of Justice ruling. So there really is no good outcome other than leaving this treaty, I'm afraid.
And the Irish government is unlikely to do that unilaterally, as you say?
They're unlikely. I've raised it a few times. I've raised it directly with the Minister Nashanat, and I've raised it with Minister Ryan at the Climate Committee. they're committed to what they say is the reform process. The problem with the reform process is that it requires unanimity to make any changes to this treaty, and Japan, who are also signed up to it, have said they don't want any changes, so they're going to veto any changes. So it feels like it's wasting time in what we have in the climate crisis, arguing and trying to reform something that, even if all of what the EU wanted to achieve in the reform was achieved, which is not going to happen because Japan said they won't accept change, it still wouldn't be Paris compliant. So it would be better to just leave. But unfortunately, every time I've asked it of the government, the minister's response is they're committed to the EU process of trying to reform it. And more worryingly, at the committee, Minister Ryan actually argued that it could be a good thing because it would give the protections to renewable energy firms and encourage investment into the country. And we've seen how that worked out in Spain. So for me, it doesn't matter if it's a renewable energy or a fossil fuel company. They should be forced to use domestic courts. They shouldn't have a private court system that takes place behind closed doors that citizens don't have access to.
Very good.
So,
we must leave it there. Senator Lynn Boylan, many thanks indeed for explaining that treaty to us.
Brilliant. Thanks a million for having me on.
You're very welcome indeed. Good evening to you.